Hi, Humanities 200 students, and welcome to your third video tutorial. This week I'm going to be talking about your project part 1, and I want to sort of talk about your major project for the course and how it's divided into two larger sections. Part 1 is what you'll be working on in the first few weeks of the term, and then part 2 is what you'll be finishing up at the end of the term. So I wanted to dive in and speak particularly about part 1, but also give you just a general overview so you can be thinking about what's coming up in the weeks ahead and what you need to be focusing on and sort of what that end goal is as far as the whole project. So you've got the part 1 and the part 2, of course. Your project part 1, you already did one step of it last week with week 2, and at that point you chose your two artifacts that you're going to be comparing and contrasting and looking at in your final project and the theme that they share, so that big idea or the main theme that they have in common. That was your sort of 1 to 2 pages introduction to your project so that your instructor can take a look at it, give you some feedback, make sure you're going in the right direction. Next week, in week 4, you're going to be completing what is considered a rough draft of the exploration document. So the exploration document is sort of the main part of this project part 1 in the first part of the term, again, to help make sure you're on the right track as far as your overall direction goes and your instructor can give you some feedback on it. So week 4, you've got a rough draft of this exploration document, and then in week 6, you'll have the final version of it due. So once again, after you complete the rough draft next week, you can get some feedback from your instructor and work on revisions and any corrections that might need to be made before you submit that final version of it in week 6. Then later on in the term, and we'll talk more about this as we get closer to it, the final steps of your project will include writing up speaker's notes for a presentation, and then in week 8, the actual final presentation itself, which can be a PowerPoint or a presentation, and you'll have slides. You'll be presenting it to a particular audience. We'll talk more about choosing that audience and so forth. So that's sort of the end goal of your project. And again, I want to focus right now particularly on project part 1 because you've gone through that very first step of it in terms of choosing your artifacts. And then I want to talk about what's going to be due next week in week 4. So last week when you chose those two works of art and their shared theme, and you had a 1 to 2 page paper to turn in for that, basically what you did was describe your two works of art, identifying who those artists were or the authors depending on what genre or medium you're using. And you talk about the common theme, the theme that they share, the reason why you're comparing those two side by side. And you also addressed what that personal experience or connection was to it, what it is that drew you to those two works and that theme in the first place. Then this week, in week 4, the exploration document, the rough draft of it, will start out with those same 3 elements. So you've already got a good part of it done, and once you get your feedback from your instructor on that submission from last week, you may be able to just go right ahead with what you've already got, and you've got that first section of your rough draft done. But then after that, you're going to be adding some more elements to it in terms of the rough draft, and this is really exploring these two works of art, how you're going to consider them, what kind of research you're going to bring in, and so forth. So in addition to the work you've already done there, you're going to be considering what kind of profession might be interested in these two works of art, or what kind of profession might feel a particular impact based on these two works of art. So this is starting to think about your audience. When you think about your two artifacts or your two works of art, you want to make a connection not only to your personal experience, but to some kind of a professional experience. What kind of field out there in terms of professions might be particularly interested in your discussion of these two works of art? How would it be relevant to them? You're also going to start looking at your resources, the research that you're going to bring in. The Snoo Shapiro Library, of course, is a great source for this, as well as some other materials that you have in your Humanities 200 Blackboard. So you're going to start exploring out there, seeing what kind of information is there to help you build on your discussion of these two works of art. And as you bring in that research, you're going to be thinking about your works, your artifacts, in a number of ways. One is that historical context. When were they created? What time period was it? What was happening in the world during that particular historical era? What are some similarities and differences they might have? Depending on the medium or the material that you're using, there may be a lot of very clear and evident similarities and differences, or they might be a little more subtle if you're looking at two films, for example, or if you're looking at a film and a painting, they might have more or less in terms of similarities and differences. And then you'll think too about the similarities and differences in terms of when they were created. You're also going to present your thesis statement in the exploration document, and that's sort of your big takeaway message of what your audience or your reader is going to walk away with in terms of how we're comparing these two works of art or comparing these two artifacts and the theme that they share. And all throughout, of course, you want to think about your audience, but as in a part of this rough draft, you're going to particularly focus on who this audience might be. Would it be some of your fellow classmates? Would it be someone who is working in the field that you're considering as far as the profession that's connected to this work? You're going to ask yourself who this audience might be. Is it someone who has a lot of experience or information about the humanities and the arts, or is it someone who might have very little in terms of an introduction to that area of study? So that's going to help affect the way you present your ideas. And along with that is helping you tailor your message to that particular audience. If you're presenting, for example, to an audience that is primarily mathematicians and scientists, there may be a certain way you approach a discussion of the humanities that would be very different from imagining you're presenting it to a group of museum employees, or you're presenting it to authors and creative writers, for example. And then at the end of your document, of course, you want to have a reference list for those research sources that you've selected, and you want to follow APA format. So this is the sort of the general outline of what you're going to be doing in this rough draft. And again, remember, in week 4, you're submitting it as a rough draft with all these elements in there as thorough as you possibly can. But again, it's an opportunity for your instructor to give you feedback and point out any areas that might need some revision or some polishing. And then I wanted to remind you of your assignment guidelines and rubrics, that you want to make sure you read and review them carefully. So the information we talk about here in these video tutorials is meant to be supplemental. It's sort of an extra additional information based on what you have already in your Blackboard shells. So when you go into your Blackboard shell, you want to click on the Turn In Assignments here. And when you do that, you'll see these different sections, the Theme 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignment rubrics, and that's where you actually submit them as well. When you click on those different links, that will pull up those rubrics for you. So the rubrics are where you're going to answer all those questions about how long does this document have to be, what kind of things do I need to include in it, how is it actually going to be graded, what's my instructor looking for specifically. So you can check in with that after you've looked at the video tutorial here to give you a general idea to get going.